All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jane White from the OHSU Library, and today I'm reprising my Samvera Virtual Connect talk. So you think you want to self-host Samvera, a How Not to Do It guide. I want to start off with a little bit of background because I haven't been big part of the Samvera community, and so people may not be familiar with me and my background. So right now, I'm the Data and Research Engagement Librarian at the OHSU Library, and there I am a member of the Digital Collections Working Group, which is the set of employees that are responsible for the governance of our digital collections, including our Samvera instance. But my work at OHSU and my membership on the DCWG is really strongly informed by my entire work history. So in addition to my library degree, my undergraduate degree is in computer engineering. So I have an unusually strong technical background and a strange and varied job history. So I've worked as a semantic modeler and ontologist, which means I've done a fair amount of RDF and OWL modeling. I had a couple solo gigs, once as a content manager and another as a corporate librarian. The latter being one where I was involved in selection of platforms to get work done. I worked briefly as a technical writer and editor. And then the bulk of my pre-library career was spent as a software tester doing quality assurance. And some ways that I like to describe myself is that I'm an expert tool user. Set me down in front of a new piece of software and I get up to speed pretty quickly. As a librarian, I like to say I fight entropy and I find things. So I like both the organization and reference side of librarianship. And I'm someone who's really good at bridging the gap between technical and non-technical. So when you have people in the room who do not have a lot of technical skill and people who, have really, really deep technical skill, I'm a good person to have in the room to like bridge communications. And that is in fact one of the reasons why I was asked to join our digital collections working group. So let's start with the beginning. How did OHSU end up with our current Samvera hierarchy-based repository? I scoured all of the documentation for the project to put together this presentation, and I found this really nice quote in the estimate document that we got from data curation experts. So the intention at the outset was to implement a hierarchy-based repository ecosystem to consolidate access and management infrastructure for our digital collections, including electronic theses and dissertations, digitized books, image collections, and research data sets. As a first step in this consolidation, OHSU wishes to develop a system to host and manage electronic theses and dissertations. So this is not precisely where we started. This is after we selected Samvera, but I do want to stress the fact that we did start out with the intention of having an ecosystem of repositories for different types of content, and that our current repository was initially conceptualized as a first step towards that. And so here's a timeline of events. In 2017, after we had spent the better part of 2016 evaluating platforms, we did hire data curation experts to do the implementation of our hierarchy-based ETD repository. And that implementation was completed early in 2018. And that's also when our repository librarian, who was the project lead, departed for a new opportunity. We hired their replacement pretty quickly. My colleague Pam Pierce started in May of 2018. And then a few months later is when I was asked to join the Digital Collections Working Group. Also, in December of 2018, our Director of Special Collections, who had been very heavily involved in the project, began their departure from OHSU. It was a staged thing because they took in over as interim director of our academic consortium before they finally decided to go full-time there. We finished our data migration out of our previous BPress repository in January 2019, and that's when we launched it to the public. That summer, we hired Notch 8, which I know they're no longer Notch 8, to upgrade the system. And then late in 2020, our metadata and digital collections librarian, who was our assistant administrator for our Samvera system, also departed OHSU. So you can see that we've had a lot of turnover. And when people leave the institution, knowledge leaves the institution, and new people come in and they may not know the whole context for everything. And in fact, it took me several years to piece together the story that I'm going to talk through today. And so some of this has something to do with how we ended up where we are. So where are we? Well, we have a system that has an extremely limited scope and that we have very little autonomy over it. And what we want is more features and more autonomy. So instead of a system that's designed just for ETDs, we'd like a system that can handle multiple types of works like oral histories, images, audio works, video works, and for each of those to have appropriate editable metadata schemas, which is something that we do not have right now. We have a lot of very messy metadata and some missing metadata. A great example of messy metadata in our case is the ETDs for just one department has at least a dozen different strings to describe the department name, some of which are just like weird variations. There are a couple with typos, but some of them are historical names of the department. And a lot of those are access points into that collection that we don't want to lose. So it would be nice if our system had some form of authority control so that we could capture all of those. As you're probably aware, especially Hyrax circa 2017, very limited bulk operations, and we really need to be able to upload and edit items in bulk. In order to get statistics about the system, do configuration, fix any problems, you have to have somebody who has the ability to log into a Unix command line and run the Rails console to get anything done. And it would be nice to at least have the stats and config in a dashboard interface that any administrative user could access. And we've kind of decided that we'd rather not do fixes ourselves. We want somebody else to handle that. And then, of course, as I previously mentioned, the system has been updated one time in 2019, and we'd really rather have regular and timely software updates. So how did we get here? Well, we were working within a lot of limits. And the biggest one, I think, was that at the time that we were evaluating platforms for a digital repository, we were also at the same time in tandem evaluating platforms for a digital asset management system. Pardon me here. Excuse me. Similar systems, but with different purposes. The DAM is for, marketing images, photographic images, some that might have photos of patients. So they represent HIPAA data because, it's identifiable information about somebody's healthcare, as well as images that need a release to use and stuff like that. So that might have limited the scope of the investigation of platforms that were available. We, of course, had a limited budget, very common in libraries, and I think this was probably the biggest constraint on the initial scope and limiting things to ETDs. We had a hard deadline. We needed to get out of our BPress system by the end of our contract, which ended at the end of January 2019 when we launched the Samvera system publicly. I think also at the time there weren't that many options available. I know that we looked at DSpace and Islandora in addition to Samvera. I'm not sure what else might have been available at that point in time. And then our biggest limitation is that we have no software application developers on staff. We seem to have had plans to hire someone. I found a job description. I found plans to share it out on various mailing lists, but in January 2017, OHSU entered a hiring freeze, and I think that's when they switched plans to contract out the development work. So all of these things ended up acting as constraints on the system. And so we have a system with a lot of gaps, the biggest one being staffing and skills. I was kind of happy to find this quote in the Samvera FAQ saying that most institutions should have at minimum one developer, one metadata librarian, and one manager who are all investing significant time in the Samvera instance. As I noted, we didn't have any developers. we had one very engaged metadata librarian, and I'm not sure exactly how engaged the manager who was working on this at the time was. And I know, having talked to other Samvera developers, some people say that you should have 3 developers. So they're varying opinions, but like with one person really dedicated to the system, we didn't really have enough. When I reviewed our requirements analysis, I noticed one really big gap was that we didn't have any scenarios for long-term system maintenance. We had beautiful scenarios for like the university archivists, for faculty, for students, but when it came to thinking about the people who'd be responsible for keeping the system up and running over the long term, there was nothing. As I've already mentioned, the implementation was limited to ETDs, so we don't have a system that's really well designed for cataloging like rare books or image collections or data sets. It seems to me that also communication, there were some gaps. I think the rest of the library staff, especially those who were stakeholders in the digital repository, but maybe not directly engaged with the project, didn't really have a clear idea of just how limited the scope of our implementation was, and how limited our ability to change the system was. In fact, when I started out on the DCWG, I was a skeptic about how limited our ability was. I was always like, really, we can't do that? And over time, I've come to understand that, yeah, actually, no, we couldn't, because we didn't have the skills and staff. Um, and then finally, there were some gaps in understanding how modern digital repositories work, not just Samvera, but in general. We had a long argument that went way back about how facets behave and whether or not having multiple resource types means that you'll confuse end users, because the metadata librarian believed that facets would display on resource types that they weren't associated with, which that's not even how our Samvera works. But we wasted a lot of time arguing about that. And then for a long time, we believed that we didn't have access to the backend interfaces like the Solar admin console and the Fedora console. It was when we were in the middle of our evaluation project that we learned that we could actually access those via an SSH tunnel, which was kind of disappointing to learn. So with all of these gaps, we ended up kind of muddling through. I do think we fell victim to the sunk cost fallacy. You know, we had spent a year or so of evaluating systems. And so I think it was hard to make a decision to not proceed with Hyrax, even though we didn't have the staff on hand. And that meant that we ended up doing a lot of status facing. So we definitely expected our metadata and digital collections librarian to fill the technical skills gaps. And that, in retrospect, was inappropriate and unfair to this member of our staff. We also ended up expecting the ETD repository to hold all of our digital collections. So everything got migrated in regardless of whether or not we could adequately represent the metadata for those collections. And when I was reviewing the documentation of the project, this is subtle, but I think it's important. I noticed that we characterized our needs as goals rather than requirements. And you know, I've worked as an ontologist, so I'm really sensitive to meaning, and I just want to point out that goals are in the future. Once they're achieved, they cease to be goals, and not achieving goals is relatively normal. People fail to meet goals all the time. And while it's disappointing, it's not always a big deal. Contrast that with requirements, which are what you need right now, and they don't stop being requirements once they're met. And if a system doesn't meet your requirements, that means it's not good enough, and you need to make deliberate exceptions to proceed. And so I think this goal-based mindset, instead of thinking of them as requirements, also led to us satisficing and muddling through with the system that we got, instead of taking that next step towards our initial goal of creating an ecosystem of Hyrax repositories for our collections. And goals also require plans. And satisficing is what happens when you don't plan. And so these are a number of plans that I've identified that we didn't make. We didn't have plans to extend the model of ETDs, because like even that data model was missing things like being able to indicate who the advisor was on somebody's dissertation. And part of that is because we directly ported our metadata model from bpress into Samvera with no modifications. And then continuing off of that, no plans to extend the data model for additional work types or to consider setting up an additional Hyrax head. We didn't have any plans to implement additional features. I mentioned authority control earlier, and I know that there is a Ruby gem called questioning authority. We didn't have any plans to implement anything like that or any additional customizations. And as I've already mentioned, no plan for long-term maintenance and updates. And then sometimes the problems that you experience are with the people who are working on the project. Sometimes it's not just like the technical problems. So I do want to talk a little bit about our metadata and digital collections librarian. This person is very talented technologist. I'm very impressed with this person's abilities. They did our data migration with tools developed by DCE that was fully within the scope of their job, and they did good work on that. But Samvera was not perhaps the best match for this person. They had very little interest in the Samvera way. They felt that the approach to development was a little overwrought, over-engineered. They're definitely more of a go fast, go alone type. And this is a person who has just all kinds of clever custom solutions and workarounds in their work. A lot of stuff that doesn't scale, but always clever, always impressive, always very skilled. And, some other things that they did that I personally consider questionable, like we still don't have a repository of all of our specific customizations of our system, because instead of making changes to code, this librarian would make changes in staging, make images of staging, and then deploy images to production. And that just, I don't know, that makes me nervous. I'm like, I'm not sure that that's the best way to be going about things. Imaging is appropriate in some contexts. I'm not sure that it was appropriate here. Because of this person's technical background, they also struggled to engage with the Samvera community for technical support. They're definitely more comfortable answering questions and asking them. And so for a while, I ended up being a go-between here, where I would come to the Samvera Slack or the Samvera Tech mailing list and ask the questions that they felt that the community would assume that they already should know the answers to. And then this person also started their library career as a cataloger, and they definitely conceptualized the repository as a catalog rather than a modern digital repository. So they were used to thinking in terms of bibliographic records. And in that model, the record is the first class object in the data model. And in Samvera and a lot of other like RDF-based data models, the works are the first class objects. And I think this is why we probably satisficed with the ETD model. This person understood everything as a record, and why would you need different types of records? And I think this also played a role in the misunderstanding over how facets behaved in Lucene Solr-based search engine systems. And anyway, this is not to say that a bibliographic model is a bad one. It's fine when it's done well, it's fast and it's flexible. Our problem is that our ETD data model made a really poor bibliographic record. And so that's a summary of our situation and our problems. And I'd like to wrap up with how the Samvera community can help organizations like OHSU avoid falling into this trap of adopting the platform when we don't actually have the resources to support it and maintain it. And the first thing I want to say is that a lot has happened since we implemented our system, and they're all good things that are making this a lot easier. So the biggest one is Haiku. Just the fact that Haiku out of the box has multiple works type is huge. And even more so, even huger is the fact that you can sign up for services like Haiku Up if you have very simple needs. If you need something more customized, you can reach out to Ubiquity repositories and get not just a Haiku-based system, but like their whole proprietary public-facing interface that's got a lot of features in it. And then I'm excited about Allenson Flex because I think that fills the gap of being able to modify your metadata schemas. And then of course, bulk racks is taking care of a lot of the bulk edit and upload issues that we encountered. So lots of good work happening on Samvera. I'm excited to see it keep going. You guys are going in the right direction. I do have a couple of recommendations though. The biggest one is that the hierarchs documentation could use a little love. If you go in and you're trying to figure out how to do something, you'll see lots of references to previous versus versions of hierarchs, and it's not clear if that means, oh, this hasn't changed since that version, so these instructions will still work, or it means like, you're on your own because we haven't documented it for the current version. And unfortunately, in my experience, the latter tended to be the case more often than the former. And then just watch out for anything as possible thinking. I don't think that this is exclusive to Samvera. I think every open source project kind of falls victim to this. While it is true when you have access to the code, technically anything is possible. But you have to have the right people on hand in order to make that happen, and we didn't. And when an organization does not have the technical staff they need, it might be harder for them to understand what they're getting into than otherwise. So those are the places where I think you guys could focus on to improve the situation so that other institutions don't end up where we did with a system that didn't meet our needs. And that is all I have. So I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. And if anyone has any questions, I can stick around and answer some.